In the summer of 1814, the War of 1812 reaches a fevered pitch on the Niagara frontier. Defying orders, American General Jacob Brown sets his sights on a bold invasion of Canada. The stage is set for two bloody battles that will test the mettle of both armies. At Chippawa, the newly trained American regulars clash with British veterans in a shocking upset. But the fight is far from over. Lundy's Lane will become a scene of unimaginable carnage, where both sides will pay a heavy price for victory. This is the story of the bloodiest battles ever fought on Canadian soil, a turning point in the war that will shape the destiny of two nations. From the icy plains where indigenous nations thrived long before the settlers arrived, to the battle smoke of the War of 1812, Canada's stories echo through time. We know the legends: Vimy Ridge, the birth of Confederation, the Summit Series that stole a nation's heart. But history isn't carved solely from grand moments. In every corner of this vast land, lesser-known tales linger. Forgotten heroes, struggles echoing in local lore, moments that shaped communities but faded from the national stage. This podcast is a journey of rediscovery. I'm no scholar, just a captivated explorer. My goal isn't to lecture, but to ignite. If my tales spark a flicker of curiosity in you, then I've succeeded. So settle in. Adventure awaits in the echoes of time. This is Canadian History with Stephen Wilson. The year is 1814. The War of 1812 rages on. U.S. Secretary of War John Armstrong hatches a bold plan so the Americans would be able to go on the offensive before the British reinforcements from Europe could arrive and sway the tide of battle. The plan would call for a two-pronged attack, the main thrust aimed at Kingston, while a feint across the Niagara River would divert British forces. The Secretary of War had also drawn up alternate plans as a contingency, and in the hope that they would fall into British hands, for a direct assault across the Niagara. Major General Jacob, however, emboldened by recent victories and frustrated by naval delays, disregarded Armstrong's orders. He set his sights solely on the Niagara. This was bolstered by the refusal of the American Navy on Lake Ontario to help until their new warships were built before leaving port. Brown gathered his men at the Niagara and looked at the options ahead of them. The Americans could launch an attack on Fort Niagara at the mouth of the river, but without the Navy there to provide support, it would be difficult. The choice of landing along the shores of Lake Erie and rushing on Burlington to cut off the men in the peninsula were also dismissed, as the American naval squadrons on Lake Erie had been called upon to help recapture Fort Mackinac on Lake Huron. The suggestion was made to Brown: why not just capture Fort Erie, which was directly across the river from Buffalo? Brown would set out on July 3rd, with 1,300 men under Winfield Scott and 1,000 men under Eleazer Wheelock Ripley. There were also 327 men in 4 companies of artillery, and they were joined by a brigade of 750 militiamen and 600 Iroquois warriors. The Americans were bringing the hammer down on the Niagara region with a significant number of regular troops who were now well-disciplined and well-trained, thanks to Scott. Fort Erie, caught off guard and outnumbered, fell swiftly into American hands. After securing the fort on July 4th, Scott set out north along the Niagara River, following a portage road where his men met British forces. A brief exchange of artillery would ensue. The Americans drew back to Streets Creek. While this was happening, Brown maneuvered other American units further upstream along the Chippawa and crossed it. On the other side of the Chippawa from Scott, however, was Phineas Riall. He had led the attacks on the Niagara Peninsula in the winter, and was a lot more daring than many of the other British officers. And Riall did not know the Americans had captured Fort Erie. He believed it to still be in the hands of the British, and that the bulk of the American forces were besieging it. He assumed his division was being faced by maybe at most 2,000 men, and those men were poorly trained with little experience. And this is probably where the phrase, "when you assume something, it makes an ass out of you and me," comes from. Believing his situation to be one of having the upper hand, Riall made the decision to cross the Chippewa and attack the Americans instead of waiting for Scott to cross over himself. On the morning of July 5th, the British soldiers under the command of Riall crossed the Chippewa. At first, it was the light infantry and the indigenous auxiliaries. The skirmishers would nearly capture Scott himself, who was having breakfast. The Americans sent up a brigade to clear away the skirmishers who were advancing through the woods, but they ended up meeting the regulars of Riall's division, which had just crossed the river. Artillery would then come into play at this point, with the Americans destroying an ammunition wagon. This all but made the British cannon ineffective, as they had nothing left to shoot. Scott had his men form up the lines. He had the 25th Infantry on the left, near the woods, with the 11th and 9th Infantry in the center. The 22nd Infantry was on the right, and they had the artillery behind them providing support. Now, in the last episode, we mentioned about how the suppliers of the uniforms for Scott's newly trained men had run out of blue cloth, and they had to make the uniforms out of gray. These gray uniforms, born out of a cloth shortage, would play a surprising role. Regulars of the American Army wore blue. The militia wore gray, same as it was amongst the Canadian militia, and this was simply because it was cheaper. When Riall saw the lines being formed of Americans wearing gray uniforms, he thought he was up against the militia, which any good British soldier held in contempt. The thought here was that a few good volleys from the British lines and the Americans would break and run back across the river, as they had done pretty much any other time throughout the war. Riall decided to launch the assault across the river. The British cannons roared with what ammunition they had left, but those shots fell short, and they failed to break the disciplined American ranks. Then the British lines moved forward, but this was rather discombobulated. During the advance, particularly over uneven ground, until they had gotten within the vicinity of where they wanted to be, infantry would march as a column, and then form up lines to engage the enemy. Moving as a column was also faster than moving as a line. When formed as a line, though, firepower was increased significantly, as more men would be able to fire their muskets forward per volley. Riall pushed for the 1st Royal Scots and the 100th Foot to advance in lines. This meant that the terrain slowed them down, and moving more slowly meant more time for the artillery behind the 22nd Infantry to get reloaded and to fire on the advancing men. And then, the advantage of the firepower of firing from line formation was lost through probably one of the dumbest orders issued during the entire War of 1812, and there were plenty of dumb orders. After firing one volley, Riall ordered his men to close with bayonets. This meant charging headlong into the enemy lines and engaging them in hand-to-hand combat. When infantry advanced like this, it took artillery out of play for the advancing side because they wouldn't want to hit their own troops from a distance. The Americans, however, were able to use this closing of the ranks to their advantage on the defensive side. They switched from round shot to canister, which decimated the ranks on the British side. Now, as the British advanced, the flanking units on the American side moved into almost a U-shape. A crossfire caught the British from the left, right, and front. Riall would wait 25 minutes before ordering a retreat. He was, however, smart enough to eventually have his men properly form up a line and exchange fire with the Americans for those 25 minutes. Now, what was the deciding factor to order the retreat? Riall got wounded. The official British casualty report was staggering. There were 148 men killed, 321 wounded. 46 men were reported as missing. The Americans had 60 men killed, 249 wounded, and 19 missing. Chippawa marked a turning point. The Americans, under Scott's rigorous training, had proven they could match the vaunted British regulars in open battle. There's one caveat to that, though. It is considered by many to be the fault of Riall for advancing foolishly and overconfidently that resulted in the American victory at Chippawa. The tactics he used were questionable. The gray uniforms of the Americans were also said to have had another impact, aside from lulling Riall into a false sense of security. And this is in terms of a long-term impact. To this day, the cadets at the United States Military Academy at West Point wear gray parade uniforms. It is said these uniforms were adopted in commemoration of Scott's victory at Chippawa. I happen to like that little tidbit, so I'll ignore the fact that on record it officially states the move to gray uniforms was due to cost. Now, after the Battle of Chippawa, the British would fall back from their position along the river towards Fort George at the mouth of the Niagara River along Lake Ontario. The Americans opted to not pursue Riall as he pulled those men back to safety. Brown didn't have what he believed was enough in the way of manpower to assault the fort, and with the British currently in control of Lake Ontario, they lacked the ability to have gunships firing on the fort to support an assault. This British control of the lake also allowed for troops to be ferried from York to Fort George, strengthening the position and improving the situation for the British. The Americans, though, did occupy Queenston, a few miles south of Fort George, and they would hold this position for a few weeks, but were under constant harassment from Canadian militia units as well as Indigenous auxiliaries. The decision was made on July 24th by Brown to pull out of Queenston and consolidate his forces at the Chippewa River. From there, they would be able to go west towards Burlington, with the hopes of at least eliminating any possibility of British reinforcements coming by land. As the Americans fell back, Riall would have his light infantry as well as some men from the militia move up. Keeping in contact with the enemy, they would advance as far as Lundy's Lane. In the morning hours of July 25th, Lieutenant General Drummond arrived on the scene for the British to personally take command of the forces. The first course of action for Drummond was to secure the flank along the east bank of the Niagara River. An order was given to Lieutenant Colonel John Tucker to advance south from Fort Niagara on the east shore of the river opposite of Fort George. The goal was that the Americans would pull back from Chippawa. Brown, however, had other plans. He decided to move his men north to force the column under Tucker to move back. What Brown didn't know, however, was that the British were set up in force at Lundy's Lane, a spur of that portage road that ran along the Niagara River. This lane ran along a part of ground that was roughly 25 feet higher than the surrounding area. This gave a bit of a good vantage point and allowed for artillery to be put into position to fire for effect. The British had their big guns there. In addition to a pair of 24-pounders and a pair of 6-pounders, there's also a howitzer and a detachment of Congreve rockets. Now, rockets were artillery, modeled after rockets that had been used by the Kingdom of Mysore against soldiers in the East India Company. These rockets could be used for long-range bombardment. They could be loaded with case shot, explosives, or a shell. They could also be fired faster than a traditional muzzle-loading cannon and coming from a further distance than a traditional cannon. They were very deadly when used efficiently. In fact, it was the use of these rockets over Baltimore that helped inspire the American national anthem. Once word came that the Americans were advancing, Riall ordered his troops to fall back to Fort George, and this order was immediately countermanded by Drummond, who had force-marched reinforcements from Fort George to Lundy's Lane to help stop the American advance. The back and forth of the orders would have the British getting just into position at 6 p.m. on July 25th as the Americans first came into view. The 1st Brigade to come into view was under the command of Winfield Scott, and as they came out of the forest into an open field, they came under immediate fire from the British artillery. They would face stiff casualties and fell back. Scott tried to outflank the British position and sent the 25th to the British left, which was close to the Niagara River. The Americans would catch the light company of the 8th King's Regiment, as well as the Upper Canada Incorporated Militia by surprise. They were forced back in confusion, as they had just arrived back at their positions after that back and forth with the orders between Riall and Drummond. Advance orders had been issued in short succession. This was followed up by a push from a light infantry company to advance to secure the intersection of Lundy's Lane and the Portage Road. This would succeed, and the Americans took a number of prisoners. Among those captured, Major General Riall. The Americans fell back to join the main body of the force, but the whole situation became chaos as a British unit intercepted them. During the skirmish, a number of prisoners escaped, but Riall was unable to get away. Scott's brigade kept moving forward, and this put pressure on Drummond to keep the center of his line in check with his left flank. He also issued orders for the Glengarry Light Infantry to fall back as well, which ended their harassment of Scott's left flank. The withdrawal back to keep everything in alignment, though, exposed the artillery. The main body of the American forces under command of Brown caught up to Scott by nightfall, and Brown then ordered the 21st Infantry to capture the British cannon. An attack on the British right by the 1st U.S. Infantry would keep them distracted. This allowed the 21st Infantry to deploy in front of the artillery just yards away. At this close range, the volley of muskets was deadly. The follow-up bayonet charge drove the British from the hill and captured the cannon. A counterattack came from the 2nd Battalion of the 89th Foot, but this was beat back by the Americans. Then the Americans brought their artillery up to the hill and started to deploy the cannon amongst the captured British guns. Drummond, though, was determined to gain back the ground lost, and there wasn't any subtlety in the slightest. He had the men form up in a line of attack and advanced. There were no pickets or skirmishers or light infantry trying to move to outflank them. This was a straight-on frontal assault. The two sides opened fire on each other from close range, the smoke from the muskets making it difficult to see as darkness grew. In the confusion, the Glengarry Light Infantry was confused for an American unit, and the British opened fire on them as well. Both sides suffering heavy casualties in the close-range combat. Drummond, however, wasn't deterred. He pulled the men back, reorganized, and tried again. He was determined to take back the high ground by using his men as a hammer. Some of the Americans started to waver in the face of the assault, but they did not fall back. They held the ground. Scott brought some of his men up to join the attack, although he had not been ordered to. Acting on his own initiative, he would end up being fired upon in the chaos of the battle by both the British and the Americans, forcing him to retreat. The British launching another assault on the hill to take back the guns, this third assault using basically every man that Drummond could find. This time the assault would include hand-to-hand fighting and bayonets. The British, though, fell back one more time, both sides exhausted. The Americans had around 700 men left in the line. The Generals Scott and Brown were both wounded. The British had around 1,400 men left, but were in no condition to continue themselves. The Americans opted to withdraw from the field first, though. The sides had fought to a stalemate, and it was the Americans who had blinked first. The next morning, Brown ordered a force to recover the British guns that had been left on the high ground in the fighting the night before. Around 1,200 men went back to the scene of the carnage from the night before to get those cannons. But there was a problem. In the middle of the night, Drummond, having received reinforcements, had already secured the position. The British had the strategic advantage and grossly outnumbered the Americans. Instead of pressing the issue, Brown made the decision to fall back to Fort Erie. To prevent the British from following them or harassing them, every bridge they crossed was destroyed as they went. To make room for the wounded, the Americans abandoned equipment and supplies, destroying much of it, so they weren't able to fall into the hands of the British. This was the deadliest battle of the War of 1812, and it is believed to be the bloodiest battle ever fought on the soil of what is now Canada. The official casualty report of the British stated there were 84 dead, 559 wounded, and 42 captured. Another 193 were reported as missing. The Americans had 171 killed in the fighting, 572 wounded, and 117 were reported as missing. There is no word as to how many of those wounded would later die as a result of those injuries. The battle itself was described as just purely carnage. The officers on the British side, who had fought in the Peninsular War just months earlier in Europe against Napoleon, were horrified at the brutality, especially when it came to the fighting at close quarters. And this is interesting to note because the Peninsular War was considered horrific on its own. Drummond later reported, "Of so determined a character were the American attacks directed against our guns that our artillerymen were bayoneted by the enemy in the act of loading, and the muzzles of the enemy guns were advanced within a few yards of ours." This battle established the American army, not the militia, but the army, as a professional force. This was all thanks to Winfield Scott, who had come up with the idea to use the French Revolutionary Army's training manuals to get them up to speed. While the movements in the Niagara Peninsula were happening, there was activity a bit further to the south. The British had held control of the Chesapeake Bay along the Atlantic seaboard in the United States for almost a year. This was a concern for American President James Madison. He would call his cabinet for a meeting on July 1st to talk about the possibility of a British attack on Washington, or possibly Baltimore, which was the thought of Secretary of War Armstrong. And it would turn out that both would be true. And so our journey through this chapter of the War of 1812 ends. In our next episode, we will go to the Chesapeake Campaign and provide some background before we look at the truth and myths surrounding the Battle of Bladensburg, the burning of Washington, and the Battle of Baltimore. Thank you for traveling alongside me. If these stories sparked a question, a memory, or just a newfound fascination, keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more hidden histories, and give us a like if you enjoyed the ride. Thank you for listening to Canadian History with Stephen Wilson.